The Amalgamated Transit Union is the largest union of transit workers in North America. So we have 200,000 members in 44 different states and 7 Canadian provinces. In the District of Columbia, we represent the 12,000 workers who move WMATA, that's Metro, Metro Access, Metro Rail, as well as DC Circulator and DC streetcar workers. So obviously when COVID-19 hit, the conversation nationally was all around frontline heroes and essential workers, and transit workers fall directly into that. We have had more than 200 members of ATU nationally pass away from COVID-19. We've had thousands that were infected on the job. So we have spent most of the last year and a half fighting for basic things, access to PPE, changes to transit system policies like front door boarding, moving that to back door, ending fare collection, improving filtration on buses, and generally trying to do what we can to keep passengers and workers on the bus, on the train, separate from each other and protected from transmitting COVID-19. It has also meant an incredible 20,000 layoffs, an incredibly high number of layoffs, forced early retirements for a lot of people who don't want to get sick doing the job. And what that's meant for the transit industry is a huge shortage of workers. And so now today, even though COVID is still raging, the fight has really switched to forced overtime because the people left on the job now are being compelled by their employers to skip vacation, work 16-hour shifts, work 6 days a week. So we both have the direct assault of the virus on our members and our riders, and we also have sort of the assault of employers who can't figure out that if they would pay people better and protect them, they wouldn't have a problem filling those jobs. So DC Jobs with Justice, in my experience, has been sort of my go-to organization for understanding how to have an impact, not just in the workplace, but in halls of power or in communities and neighborhoods. So for ATU, that fight began with DC Jobs with Justice in 2015. Around the privatization of the DC Circulator and the DC streetcar. Circulator had long been privatized, streetcar was being built and was way overdue and over budget. But what we learned is that those workers that were getting hired were going to be making significantly less an hour, over $8 an hour less on average than Metro Rail workers, above ground, below ground, rail operators in the same city, making substantially different wages, also completely different healthcare and retirement plans. So you would not know that these people were both running rail systems in the same city by the way the city planned to contract out their work. So we called DC Jobs with Justice, and they helped us get an understanding of how the DC Council functions, who's who holds what power where and what purse strings where. And we engaged in a campaign not only with DC Jobs with Justice, but they brought other labor unions, faith institutions, community organizers to the table. And we were able to focus not just on the effect on transit workers, but the effect that privatization has on public workers and especially on black workers in the District of Columbia. So postal services being privatized, transit being privatized, the charter school movement and the privatization of public schools. And so we were able to start building a coalition over the years with DC Jobs with Justice as the center of that focused not just on what happens in the workplace when your job gets contracted out, but what happens to our communities when thousands of jobs get contracted out, especially for black workers. So what I think is most interesting about DC Jobs with Justice is when you're looking to build coalition with people, there's overlapping interests, there's a lot of things you're evaluating, but one of those things is overlapping values, sort of a shared idea of how power should be built and how it most effectively can be deployed. And just because somebody is a labor union or just because they're a community organization does not mean they share the same perspective on those things. DC Jobs with Justice does. It views organizing working class people to take power for themselves and to take resources for themselves as the key to changing society and communities. And so while we may have been able to call the AFL-CIO or somebody else and say, let's get some unions around a table, it's more than just unions that you need backing you up in these fights. Labor unions only represent about 9% of working people in the United States. It's a little bit higher in DC, but what that means is you're not going to win with labor unions alone. And DC Jobs with Justice knows that. It's built into its foundation. It's why it exists. And so when you want to take on a privatization fight, a wage theft fight, a paid leave fight, anything like that that involves going to elected officials and trying to convince them that their job is actually to protect workers and to support workers, DC Jobs with Justice is the place to go, because they're going to bring faith institutions to the table. They're going to bring tenant organizers and housing organizers to the table. And at the center of all of those movements and all of those activities is a common belief that you have to put power in the hands of workers so that they can fight for themselves and they can win for themselves. So I think probably the most profound was the DC Circulator fight that we had, which was a few years ago. DC Circulator workers were fighting for wage parity. They work for a private multinational contractor. They drive buses in the same city as their Metrobus counterparts. They stop at the same stops. They literally transfer to each other. And they're funded by at least one of the same jurisdictions. And yet they were making almost $10 an hour on average less. They had no health care to speak of, no retirement plan to speak of, and really shoddy work conditions. Buses where the brakes didn't work, where wheels were coming loose, doors were flying open mid-service. And so working with DC Jobs with Justice and other labor and community allies, we put together a coalition of people to focus specifically on the safety of the vehicles. And when we were able to reveal through an audit of the workers that 90% of the vehicles were not safe for the road, it suddenly, a light bulb went off for a lot of people in the city. And DC Jobs with Justice was poised to take advantage of that. And you say, see, there's a connection between the safety of these vehicles, which you're concerned about because you ride a bicycle, ride on that bus, cross the street in front of it, and the treatment of the workers. And so in that fight, through pressure on the DC Council alone, we were able to win extra funding for DC Circulator, which meant that we achieved wage parity. So for DC Circulator workers, or 200 bus operators, they saw an average wage increase in a single year of 30%, which anybody in any field that got a 30% raise in a year would tell you that their quality of life drastically improved. DC Jobs with Justice organizes sort of on a model that you'll see in a lot of different places, but I think their fundamental difference is that they are at an intersection of every movement in the city. So while I can get a group of workers that move people in transit, and I might be able to talk to other unions and get them there, I am talking to one sliver of that pie. And Jobs with Justice at all times is not only convening, but constantly organizing within institutions and between institutions to pull people together. And so when you go to a Jobs with Justice action or event, you're never seeing a bunch of people just from one union or a bunch of people from one church or mosque or anything else. You are seeing people mobilized from every cross-section in the District of Columbia, every movement, whether it's environmental or student justice or worker justice. You're seeing everybody represented at that table, which means that these fights are intersectional by nature. People, thanks to Jobs with Justice, people see the connectedness between what might seem like an isolated fight with one worker or one group of workers and the well-being of everybody in the community. So one example is that stands out to me is the Just Pay Coalition fight that DC Jobs with Justice was a major player in. One action they did in particular that I attended that really changed how I thought about things as a labor organizer was they had an action outside of a building site for Power Design. And Power Design had been stealing wages from their workers. And it's not abnormal for people to protest wage theft, but as a labor organizer, it's very unusual to have a community organization lead an action and organize an action on your behalf. So to go there and hold a banner and leaflet and talk to some of the people coming into the building site about what was happening there, and it not to be led by a union or even the group of workers, but a community organization that's working in coalition with those workers. Every single person that came out that I talked to wasn't actually a worker there because they were afraid. They were afraid of being retaliated against. They were afraid of being attacked. And it was the first time, I think, for me that I actually saw that neighbors would stand up for workers in what seems like an employment fight because they could see the connectedness between the development in DC that's happening and the way people are being gentrified out and the exploitation of the workers at the work site. So when DC Jobs with Justice organizes, it organizes intersectionally across sort of the movement of movements, and it brings people together on fights big and small. And I think that's the other part of it. There's no sense that the fight has to be glamorous. You know, there's a lot of fights that people want to be a part of because they're fun and they're big and they're aspirational. And DC Jobs with Justice leads many of those. But there's also fights that are about delivering material resources for people today that they need to survive. And DC Jobs with Justice doesn't push those aside. It takes them on with just as much sort of vigor and energy and focus as they would any bigger premier fight. I have been a monthly contributor to DC Jobs with Justice for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, which is less time that I've been involved with DC Jobs with Justice, but once I had the money to start giving to them, I chose to. And the reason for that is, as a union member and as a union organizer, I understand the financial power of regular monthly or regular frequency contributions to an organization, because it's about, and I think Jobs with Justice uses the right name for it, it's about sustaining an organization. I think one of the faults of people in a lot of movements that we have and we all share is we tend to get involved because of a single fight or a single campaign, and we're very energetic and we put everything into it. We put our money and our time into it for 3 months, and then we burn out or we win or whatever happens, and we let it fade. And DC Jobs with Justice is sort of the flame that's always lit. So when big campaigns or big premier public relations focused fights come, DC Jobs with Justice is there, but when the lights turn off and the cameras move away, they're still there. And so sustaining them and sustaining that organization to me is really important, because I want to make sure that there's sort of somebody on watch for workers, for my community, when maybe the fight isn't drawing as much attention as usual. And as an organizer, it takes a lot of work and resources to do that kind of sustaining work. We build campaigns oftentimes years ahead of time, and you don't see them break the surface or go public until that last year. And people don't often appreciate how much has to be spent, how much staff time, how many resources, how much convening and community space has to be rented to lead that kind of fight. So giving monthly to an organization like DC Jobs with Justice strikes me as a no-brainer. I want somebody, when I have to turn my attention to a different fight or elsewhere, I want to know that there's somebody who's being a watchdog for workers in DC, and I think that's what DC Jobs with Justice does. So I think DC Jobs with Justice is an organization anybody should be contributing to, especially if you don't have a union. Most workers, 90% of workers don't have a union. They should organize one. But I can tell you, if you're going to, I would talk to DC Jobs with Justice about how to get there and who to connect with. I view it as sort of the down payment you need to make for the fights that you're planning to run, because when you organize your coworkers, maybe you organize tenants in your building around rent, maybe you need to make a difference in the way school funding happens in your community, maybe you need to focus on funding for the transit system. DC Jobs with Justice is going to be the sort of biggest bang for your buck. It's going to be the best investment you can make, because if you support DC Jobs with Justice, and you come to them when you need help someday, a year or 2 years down the future, they're going to bring to the table everybody you need. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I think people sometimes think it's overstated. But to this day, I've been in DC for a decade doing this work. To this day, it is the only organization that is consistently there, consistently pulling parties together, consistently debating what we need to win a fight, analyzing power, mapping out communities. So donating regularly to DC Jobs with Justice is going to pay dividends for you down the road. And it's important to build power. We do this because so often we rely on politicians or campaigns to solve our problems, and I don't think anybody is naive enough to think that they're always going to be there for you. They're going to base their support around the way votes work and the way the winds are blowing. Building power isn't about sort of putting money to whichever direction the wind blows. It's about putting money into each other. It's about building a fund that the community can collectively use, that working class people can collectively use and draw from when they need to fight back. And DC Jobs with Justice is the best place to do that. So I think some people think that DC is a great place because of the amenities. You'll hear this word a lot, especially with new developments. We're going to bring amenities to the community. But what you learn when you move here or when you grow up here, I think you see it even better, is that DC is not getting better for most working people, right? DC is a place that is getting more unaffordable and more difficult to live. But I think that we would be in a much more deteriorated condition, if that makes sense. Let me start over. I think a lot of people think DC is a great place to live because all this new development is bringing all of these new amenities and all these interesting places and nightlife and places to go and things to do. But the fact is that for working class people, DC is a very difficult place to live. And what I've seen the last few years for the first time in a decade in DC is it doesn't feel like we're destined to lose that fight. It feels like we're actually starting to win things. And when you campaign as a labor organizer or even on political campaigns, especially when you're fighting for something you believe in, you get accustomed to sort of, we moved the ball down the field. We did something slightly better, but we didn't quite win. And over the last few years in DC, we really have started to win. I think of the Accrued Sick and Safe Leave Act in DC, which was a DC Jobs with Justice campaign. I was working with a group of bus operators in DC who were getting disciplined for taking sick days. Their rights were being violated right there. One phone call to DC Jobs with Justice, and it was like, here's who we need to go to on the council, here's where we need to take this up. And workers actually have that protection now. They never had it. They have real sick leave, even if you don't have a union contract that you can rely on. And frankly, even if you have a union contract that doesn't do well on paid sick leave, there's a law now that actually protects it. On paid family leave, which was a multi-organizational effort, but DC Jobs with Justice was there bringing people to the table and bringing people to the council. And now people actually have paid family leave in DC. Wage theft is another one. As a union organizer, it's my job to make sure people's wages aren't getting stolen. But again, with 90% of workers not actually having union representation, we rely on governments to enforce laws. And frankly, they don't do it. So what did DC Jobs with Justice do? They launched a campaign to make sure that the government was actually enforcing wage theft laws. And you see today, regularly, large employers in the district stealing wages being sued by the government. And that's because DC Jobs with Justice put the pressure on. And as a renter, I've rented my entire adult life. And as a tenant, you see landlords, especially in DC, large landlords that have a lot of political power, get away with slum conditions and abusing tenants and taking advantage of tenants. And so who's there running a reclaim rent control campaign that actually has some support on the DC Council now, and we have hope that we might actually get, it's DC Jobs with Justice. So without DC Jobs with Justice, DC would be a gilded city, unlivable to most of the people that work in the hotels and the restaurants and the industries that keep DC moving. But thanks to groups like DC Jobs with Justice, it's actually a place where people still have something to hang on to and to fight for, and frankly are winning for the first time in a long time. I'm excited to see sort of DC Jobs with Justice mark 20 years because I think that we need at least another 20 of an organization like this working hard, right? Because I think over the last few years, from the 2016 election through the pandemic, the uprising, or after the murder of George Floyd, I think, for me at least, I'm seeing people for the first time connect the dots. They understand how over-policing is related to unemployment, is related to how the cost of housing. They see how resources are being extracted from working people by the very wealthy, and that reliance on an election every 4 years is not making the difference. And so having an organization that has spent 2 decades, the better part of my life, has spent 2 decades pulling people together across the intersection of movements to help them see this, means DC Jobs with Justice is poised to sort of be the organization that carries this new intersectional movement for housing justice, worker justice, racial justice forward, environmental justice too. So I'm looking forward to it, and I think DC Jobs with Justice is, I think, just getting started. Its day has really come because people are realizing what the founders of DC Jobs with Justice, what the staff, the board members, the sustaining contributors, and everyone else have known for these past 20 years, which is if we don't bring all of this together into one big movement of movements, we're always going to be fighting if weaker and with less power than we would if we united together. And so I think DC Jobs with Justice's moment has come, and so I'm going to keep giving money every month.